Hi everyone, warm welcome to our VeeamON Global Launch virtual event. I'm Raymond. I'll be your moderator for this fireside chat style of panel discussion. And joining me as the panel speakers are my two teammates, Ben, Field CTO for APJ, as well as David, Field CISO for APJ. They have hosted numerous security workshops like tabletop style zero-day resilience workshop with our C-suite executive, right, our customers. Plus, their view from the ground, voices from the ground, based on the technology with security in focus, embracing the overall data resilience that is of interest and insight to us, right? Which brings me to the topic of discussion over here, right? Which is all about data resilience. How do we navigate through the non-compromising compliance, regulations, and governance, at the same time maintaining the highest alert on data resilience with the rampant proliferation of cyber threat, specifically ransomware, right? So let's get started. I'll probably pose the first question to Ben while I'll run through this question and give some context. All right, Ben, for question one, right? Let me just set the context, right? We do hear a lot of customers over the last 2 years has been contemplating or deliberate kind of decision making, which is still in progress, right? From not being locked down by a particular virtualization platform from an infrastructure perspective, having a two-vendor strategy where some regions are implementing that right now, or some organization already has that, right? And stretching that across into the cloud environment. Customers of ours, or the customers out there are looking into, even for hyperscalers, we should have two vendors just in case I get locked down and I do not have redundancy from multiple aspects, right? So Ben, on this first question, right, what do you think about the most talked about over the last 2 years, Broadcom acquisition of VMware? At the same time, customers is still running very much on VMware, and how do we push that forward into not being locked down and alternative and so on and so forth, right? Across APJ for sure. Ben.
Yeah, it's a very relevant question for this market and globally, quite frankly. I think, Broadcom obviously acquired VMware a couple of years ago. And fundamentally, they have restructured the virtualization game completely from their end. For enterprises, they've seen cost increases. Partners, they had uncertain times in the beginning, and a lot of organizations were forced into, contracts, 2 to 3 year contracts, which are starting to come out, in the 26, 27 kind of range. And more recently, a further culling down of the available partners that are going to be able to actually acquire VMware at the end of that. So yeah, it's creating a lot of turmoil, and I think you can see that certainly in our own strategy here, broadening hypervisor support. We've bought 3 or 4 different hypervisors on, in this last year, or announced, things like Scale Computing, HP VM Essentials, Proxmox, and some beta supports for some other hypervisors as well. So we're broadening support generally for hypervisors to give partners and customers more choice. I think the other thing that feeds really nicely into this is our portability play. We've always been very strong at the ability to use Veeam as a tool to move data from public cloud to hypervisor, or from hypervisor to hypervisor. And so you can start seeing those features build up and the matrix building out with more compatibility. I think overall, when it comes to VMware and what it might mean, I think VMware have also collapsed SKUs. We're seeing this real transition across to VCF, collapsing lots of products down into, a handful of SKUs, which is going to mean a lot of change regardless for customers, and also some uncertainty around the hardware and things that they're using too. Maybe that's not going to be compatible. Maybe the investments they've made in certain things. So I think naturally everyone is looking more broadly across the region for alternative hypervisors that they can either purchase or they can afford. But people are going to have to innovate, and I think that's what we're seeing a lot of in this region, is this innovating beyond this kind of VMware monoculture that we've become accustomed to forever, because it has been this sort of almost de facto hypervisor of choice. And the other thing that I guess we're seeing in terms of the market is we're starting to see more customers fall down, like changing the way they're certifying their end users. They're going to need to retrain. And all of this takes time, onto sort of cloud native Kubernetes type options or these alternate hypervisors. So yeah, generally it is fundamentally changing this market, obviously globally as well, but very much affecting APJ as a whole. We have conversations like this every single event that we have, every partner we engage with, every customer that we talk to.
Thanks, Ben. A couple of good and strong points that you mentioned over there, right? I think disruption does also brings opportunity, and it does also, on the positive side, facilitate certain transformation moving forward, right? And customers are also taking this opportunity to look into other platforms, as in going to the cloud of choice. It could be the hyperscalers, or even going to containers or Kubernetes, right? Ben, as you mentioned, right? The more choices of platform that you can embark in, and at the same time, right, moving forward, customers will know that, especially when it comes to data, that's where Veeam, our forte is. When it comes to data, the data is owned by the customers. The customers should know when they can get this, even though there's a change of the infrastructure of the platform, right? They still own the data. They still need the data whenever they need that, right? And to your point that you mentioned, data mobility and portability, that's where the data move around where the customer needs and not dependent on any hardware or any investment of infrastructure that you're putting up, right? So good point there. Let me move on to the second question. So the second question is more towards still within our APJ region on leveraging the hypervisor as an opportunity to reimagine the overall data disaster recovery plan, or even data resilience, right, through a regulatory compliance, which is our main topic over here, right? So Ben, I'll put it across to you to start this off, right? And probably I'll get David to share a bit on the regulatory compliance, if I could. Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, very relevant, and obviously very much coupled to hypervisor choice, right? Is I think the squeeze that Broadcom have put on hypervisor market here and APJ is really starting to trigger a complete rethink of DR in general. We used to have very traditional DR infrastructures. Maybe it was VMware at both sites and some data centers and things, but now I think a lot of organizations are having to rethink that. They're starting to think about kind of decoupling that strategy completely from hypervisor, so it's independent, no matter how things change in the future. And I think that's genuinely like a good thing for it to happen. Obviously, the portability thing that we've talked to plays very well into this. Veeam's ability to orchestrate and move data around between these different platforms gives customers choice. And I think what we're also seeing is customers really rethinking that second site. Maybe they're still wanting to invest in on-premise or partner managed infrastructure, but maybe their DR is actually a public cloud. And so sovereignty and all the things that David sort of specializes in terms of compliance within these different regions and the different markets that have different sovereignty requirements, making sure that customers are aware of where they're going to be landing this information and are they compliant in doing that. And so it's caused a lot of turmoil in terms of where we could land things. And I truly think where we'll land is probably this hybrid cloud mentality where DR lives in the public cloud if your primary's on premise. And I think you can start seeing some of that through our product roadmap too. More recently announced is instant recovery out of Veeam Data Cloud Vault. Being able to actually spin up a machine out of Vault into a public cloud and register it, in sub 5 minutes. That really changes the game, and it fundamentally changes what we've been able to do previously with this cloud infrastructure. But now that technology is possible and coming, I think this is going to give APJ organizations a lot of flexibility in terms of where their DR site might be.
Thanks, Ben. A good tee up, right? I think on the compliance, regulatory compliance side, right? So David, I believe, has spoke to a lot of our C-suite executive, especially on the CISO side from a security standpoint, as well as that does goes into the regulatory or local rules, local laws, right? So David, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we've talked about one of the big things here, which is a significant change in architecture. And anytime there's that kind of shift within an organization, it's a really good time to revisit things like risk profiles, because you're fundamentally changing the architecture of the technology within your organization. You're introducing new opportunities potentially for both threat actors to take advantage of. But you also need to be mindful of the regulatory space you're operating in. So I think, revisiting things like best practices, we spend a lot of time talking about best practices as you bring in new architecture, ensuring that you're configuring not just the environment that you're putting your new platform into, but ensuring that the best practices around that platform are being fully leveraged. A lot of times, we see deployments of capabilities being put in place, but the security is an afterthought. So I think security and looking at the regulatory space has to be at the top of mind and at the forefront anytime you're spending, this time to reimagine the way that you're going to be leveraging, say, your data resilience or your data recovery capabilities. The region is very fragmented. If we look across APJ, we're not fortunate enough to have one regulated environment that sort of covers multiple countries like other parts of the world. Every country within ASEAN is either leading towards a heavily regulated space, or they're already there and they're looking at other countries to sort of get guidance in how to do that. And I think our ability to understand that as we work with customers across these different places to bring in those best practices and learnings that we also get as we're supporting them to re-architect their environments is really helpful. And then you see countries like Australia and Japan who are kind of on that leading edge, who have traditionally been the fastest to adopt new capabilities, particularly in the cloud. And as Ben said, we're moving into this hybrid environment. So we're really mashing together the learnings and the experience from across the region and how best to address things like data sovereignty and how we're able to support, the transfer of data across borders, should that be required, and being able to provide the autonomous reporting around keeping that visibility of where the data is and how it's being used.
Thanks, David. I definitely would like to dwell in deeper into the part of the specific regulation, right? But really like your thoughts on security should not be an afterthought, right? Or even security should be at the top of the mind in anything that you are embarking or any of the strategy that you're putting in, right? Whether it be just a data protection strategy to the overall data resilience. That's the reason why we are talking about the data resilience journey where Veeam is bringing across to the customers, right? And Ben, as you mentioned, right, we have started off with alternative redundancy and so on, right? Moving to a cloud of choice as part of disaster recovery side, right? I mean, redundancy is part of what we need to do to be a lot more optimum when it comes to, it could be defending across the cyber criminals, right, from a security standpoint, or it could be just a daily recovery of data, right? So it's spread across multiple importance and criticality, right? So that brings me to the third question. I'll start with David. Probably you'll be the best person to kind of answer this, right? The uniqueness, right? What unique challenges in APJ organization that we have spoken to, in the customers that we have spoken to, in the complexity? There's a lot of metrics when it comes to data protection, specifically data protection regulation. You mentioned data privacy and so on and so forth, as well as the maturity of different regions in implementing the data privacy, right? Some are a lot faster, like in EMEA, they have the GDPR for quite some time, and then into our region in APJ, some other countries or even government are just embarking into this data privacy law, right? So what's your thoughts on that, David?
There's a few challenges, right? I think I mentioned the first one is just the diversity of the region in itself. We have, upwards of 30 odd different countries represented within this region. And they're all at various degrees or stages of deploying regulatory requirements around data and data privacy. And we're also starting to see a shift now towards things like resiliency requirements or resiliency acts or bills that are being addressed now in governments around the region. We're seeing that in places like Indonesia, Australia, even India, as they, the Digital India Act is coming in. And unfortunately, what's happening is we've got a lot of fatigue in organizations. They've got frameworks that they're trying to comply with to oversee and guide and provide governance around the security controls that they're bringing in. But they've also got to be constantly looking outward at the speed in which regulations are changing. I mean, just this year, we've seen data privacy regulations changed in a number of countries around the regions. And so, companies are requiring the platforms that they have in place to provide that agility and flexibility to very quickly update things around data protection, but also retention policies, and being able to understand, where their important data is and who's having access to it. So I think that's the big thing is just the nuance around, the variability that's around the region. The other thing is that, boards of these organizations, board members need to understand their role in this and the accountability that's required in order to reassess risk as the regulatory environment shifts. I think for CISOs that we're speaking to, as Ben and I and others are going out and doing these workshops, is that the CISOs are kind of the ones who are doing that outward view all the time and trying to understand how that regulatory environment's changing and provide that feedback in terms of guidance in the right language to the stakeholders on boards. And, we've been doing some work with the Singapore Directed Institute, and we've reached out in Australia as well. There's a lot more awareness being built into board level discussions around things like AI adoption and what does that mean as well. So I think the recovery position of an organization has to be very mindful of that external view. But likewise, looking internally, we're also seeing this variability between verticals or industry. So typically, FSI has been the first and often leaning in with a lot of the shifts around how they guide or even drive regulatory change with regards to security. But there's now a heavy focus on critical infrastructure. And so we've been spending a lot of time. We have a lot of critical infrastructure providers coming into our workshops, trying to understand what are the best practices around not just wrapping security around the architecture and their environment, but around recovery and response. Our Coveware team, as we're spending time, leaning in on, extortion and ransomware attacks, critical infrastructure environments are now facing regulatory mandates around, do they have incident response plans in place? Are they regularly practicing and working on those? They're having to operate in a space where they're providing or having to provide updates about potential breaches within minutes or hours of something happening. So do they have the communication protocols within an organization to be able to do that? So there's a lot happening in this space, and it's forcing organizations to really think about recovery and response in this new environment.
David, makes sense, right? I mean, cyber extortion readiness as well as response is crucial, right? And it's important. For sure, we have to cater for any incidents, and we see a lot of rampant cases of ransomware happening week in, week out, right, on the daily basis, and to be ready for any situation that happens where you have the rightful service level to bring back your operation is of crucial importance over here, right? So, Ben, on this question itself, right, how does technology play in part of that protection, regulations, and so on, right? What do you think about the technology insight on this here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it comes down to that understanding your regulations, to David's points, understanding what your requirements are. And I think as we see more data move to clouds, be that's where you're moving your workloads to, or where you're looking towards your protection, something like a backup as a service, offering, making sure that those platforms are meeting your regulatory requirements in terms of where the data's processed, where the data's held. And I think you can see that across, our investments in APJ. We already have a number of regional pods where we have the ability to protect Microsoft 365, for example, and even more choice when it comes to offsite, secure immutable storage through Veeam Data Cloud Vault. And so by us kind of rolling these out into more of these regions, we hope to kind of cover off, and tick a lot of boxes for a lot of organizations who are having to kind of meet these new kind of, these regional rules or compliance frameworks that are sort of coming out.
Thanks for that, Ben. Obviously, it goes into the common knowledge of people, process, and the technology that Ben has mentioned, right? And obviously, as what David mentioned, a overall data strategy that kind of embraces the people, process, and technology, whereby regulation, governance is all in play, right? So let's move on to the next question. And Ben, I'll probably start off with you, right? I think you're very much onto the threat intelligence side, as what David has mentioned. We do have a department in Veeam that's doing very specialized in doing the cyber extortion threat and response, right? What's your thoughts on the emerging? It's always been emerging, not just emerging, right, but it's pretty rampant, as mentioned earlier on, the security threats. Within APJ, for me, I don't see there's much of a difference. What's happening in the rest of the world are probably the same as what is happening in APJ. The trend is coming in. And how does this shape into a data resilience strategy that customers should be or is really embarking on?
Yeah, I think you're right, Ray. Like, our own CoveWare data shows that, no one region is immune. It's pretty broadly spread, these attacks, the types of attacks, even right down to the kind of industry demographic. I think it's pretty broadly spread. Unfortunately, some organizations, some industry demographics are maybe a bit more public and in the news than others, but it's definitely pretty widespread across, the region and the globe. I think some of the things we see a lot of, and we talk about initial access vectors and things around, how these threat groups are getting into the environment first. Our CoveWare data shows, for example, phishing is still number one or number two. It sort of flicks every sort of quarter. And I think things like AI, unfortunately, it's not necessarily an emerging threat. I think it's definitely here, and it's becoming accelerated with AI. The accuracy of these phishing campaigns. There was even a study done the other day around an end-to-end attack completely driven with a large language model. It was a research paper that was developed, and actually a security research group actually found this piece of malware and sort of raised the flag, and then that research group said, "Oh yeah, sorry, that was us doing this paper," and they released a really interesting paper around a completely automated attack using a large language model, even using private models and things too. So I think AI is here to stay. It's here to accelerate these attacks, through lots of different means. So I think that's the one way that threat groups are using them. And then I think there's also some other sort of regulatory complexities that are coming in with their own adoption of AI. Things like I'm sure we've all seen cases online where someone's accidentally pasted some personal information into maybe a public chatbot and weren't fully aware of all of the compliance reasons or how that data might be reused. So I think this unauthorized use of, say, generative AI or AI in general, that your organization hasn't signed off on what the platform is, what the large language model is, any, what use cases that can and can't be used, what type of data can and can't be used, and understanding that's really creating some kind of blind spots. This shadow IT mentality that we've been used to for so many years is just kind of reincarnated itself in this AI world. And so I think, we need to be really careful around how we're implementing our AI strategies. And then on top of that, when we are deploying these AI platforms, making sure we have observability of them, what's going on within them, but also that we're protecting them. We're protecting, maybe it's the training data if you're training models, make sure we can go back and prove how the model was trained, what data it was trained on, right the way through to if it is providing a critical function in our organization, making sure that we can protect that and also recover these complete AI platforms, because we're seeing a lot of new infrastructure be deployed on new clouds. There's new types of kind of technology that we're starting to consume that's enabling us to to kind of deliver this to our organization. So making sure we've got a comprehensive strategy, we know what data it's got access to, we know it's being protected, and we know we've got observability over it from not only an uptime, but also, like a compliance lens, a security lens, making sure it's not inadvertently getting access to, data it shouldn't, or it's being abused.
Thanks, Ben. Definitely, I like your passion, not just on the threat intelligence, but also on the AI ML, right? Thanks for taking that up. We will have a question that we definitely got to talk about the AI, how is the impact and so on, right? The innovation coming in, right? But before going to the next question, right, David, just wanted to hear from you, right, with regards to cybersecurity threat in this questions that we are discussing over here, right? As well as combining that with data resilience strategy, right? How does that build into the overall governance, right? Does regulation take into consideration of combining, protecting your data, as well as the cyber threat coming in, and then that builds an overall data resilience strategy, right? Okay, what's your thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, I liked how you teed this up. You know, we always hear these words emerging and evolving when we talk about cybersecurity, and to be honest, it has been emerging and evolving for as long as I can remember, probably for the 20 years that I've been doing this. And so it's almost redundant to say that. And in many ways, it's much of the same old thing, right? I think, as Ben mentioned, a lot of the threats that we're seeing, and it's, you know, every day there's another big brand, you know, showing up in the news, you know, just as we're recording this, you know, this week there's been more high visibly recognizable brands in media, and the humans have really become, you know, the target. And I think the social engineering aspect of facilitating cybersecurity threats has really come into the fore, and a lot of that is to do with AI, and I know we're going to talk more about that and what Ben was saying, but it's really down to speed now, and it's how quickly organizations are able to keep up with the threat actors. The threat actors are not limited around their use of technologies and innovation. They're out there, you know, going very quickly, and what's happening is you see companies and regulators trying to keep up. And the way that they're trying to keep up is that they're almost handcuffed a little because of, you know, best use or, you know, guidelines that are in place to try and ensure that these new capabilities are being used safely and deployed safely in the company. And the regulators are sort of watching the landscape and seeing these new attack types, like Ben mentioned, where, you know, AI capabilities are being leveraged to more quickly discover vulnerabilities or more quickly provide exploitable code of those vulnerabilities. And so there's just this complete disparity in speed in being able to keep up with that. And a lot of the times it's not about technology. So, you know, this year we released our data resilience maturity model, or our DRMM. And that really calls out the requirement for an organization to look at this much more holistically, particularly in a time where every vendor seems to be talking about resilience and kind of loosely tying that back to their portfolio. We've really taken the stance that there needs to be a way of defining a journey for an organization that cuts across their strategy, their people, their process, and their technology, which is that backbone, but lead them to defining how they can unlock both maturity, but also value as they adopt these practices that are defined in building resilience maturity within their organization. And that's things like being able to reduce the impact, being able to recover faster, but more importantly, being able to ensure that they're able to live and operate through an incident without impacting on customer and stakeholder trust.
Thanks, David. Totally makes sense, right? I mean, a combination of the overall technology, as what Ben has mentioned, with AI and ML, leveraging on that for good use, right? And then having that governance and regulation, getting a lot more in control how we are utilizing this AI and ML, right? And that leads me to the next question of interest, right? Which is kind of everyone's interest. How are the APJ organization balancing that? I mean, sometimes you call it responsible AI and ML, right? How do we balance the innovation initiative that's revolving around or leveraging on AI and ML with the data governance? I know that there's a bit of regulation over here, but Ben, I'll probably throw it to you to start off with from a technology standpoint, right? How does that match in, right? Yep.
Yeah, I think this is a really tricky one. And talking with organizations, a lot of organizations in APJ are struggling with this, because I think you've got two sides of the business. You've got the security compliance sort of side of the business, which is very risk adverse, making sure that everything is covered off the way that it should be, all the things that they care about naturally. And then you've got, I guess, the innovators within the organization. You've got excited business departments, marketing teams, sales departments, all trying to rush to they see these wonderful use cases online and they're kind of rushing to this innovation. So I think there is a balance to be had. We don't necessarily want the security and compliance teams to completely stifle innovation, but equally we don't want the innovation to sort of outpace and could cause, serious risks for our organization. So I think it's in the organizations I see doing this the best have actually sort of almost stood up like an AI governance committee, for any AI initiative, and it contains members that are broad across all the organization, so that they can kind of decide how and what they're going to spin up, understanding the requirements. What is the requirement of this AI initiative that we're trying to roll out? The security team can then feed in, okay, well, we see risks here. How are we going to cover those off? And then when you're kind of ready to move that forward, making sure you're doing the due diligence on those AI platforms, whatever model you're using, whatever platform you're using, have you evaluated things like private AI for very certain, very sensitive use cases? And do you understand fully the kind of licensing terms and how your data might be reused, or how the kind of inputs and outputs from, potentially a generative AI conversation could be used for future model development by whatever provider you're using? There's a lot of complexity in there, and I think getting some right guidance around that, making sure that you're undertaking these AI initiatives with information, and making kind of data-driven decisions rather than just kind of rushing in. And then I think when you're standing up these two, and try and build in the security and the privacy from day one. Don't think that you're going to bolt this on later, because that will never happen. We've all kind of kicked projects down the road, and unfortunately security and privacy isn't always the sexiest project out there. So I think if we don't embed this in our culture, and that goes for just data resilience and security and compliance in general within these AI initiatives, then they'll fail. People will lose confidence. It'll start acting out of turn, or bleeding information that it shouldn't, because we didn't do that due diligence up front. We didn't embed that from day one. And then, just covering it off, I suppose, with the point I made earlier, making sure that any of these new platforms and systems that you're standing up, you can capture, you have observability of it, you can protect and recover from them. That's absolutely critical, like any other production system that we might be running.
Thanks, Ben. David, I'll probably scope this question down to in a highly or heavily regulated sector, right? Especially when it comes to cross-border data sharing, when you're leveraging on AI, right? And obviously AI possibly has a lot more exposure into your data across countries, across region, right? Which might trigger a fair bit of not just a fair bit, but lots of sovereignty concerns, as we spoke about governance earlier on, right? As well as the AI ethics framework, right? Which is at a different rate of adoption, different rate of maturity when it comes to some of our APJ jurisdiction, right, as compared to the rest of the world, right? So, David, what's your thoughts and insight on that, right, when it comes to a highly regulated sector in using AI with data in play, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. It goes back to one of my my earlier comments around the FSI space and the critical infrastructure place. Both of these industry verticals are really pushing hard on ensuring that governance and policy around that is in place. We're seeing already regulatory changes happening around the region. We've seen Singapore step up and provide assurance and inputs into governance around AI, particularly as it relates to specific verticals, things like healthcare and insurance, and FSI more generally. Because if you look at the underlying premise of AI, you're bringing in multiple data sets in order to train and provide value, and those interconnected systems obviously are creating additional exposure points around the data. And so the integrity of that data, the confidentiality and the availability of that data, which is kind of the triad that us, security geeks always look at, becomes so much more critical. Australia, we're starting to see heavy emphasis on things like the ethics principles around that, and ensuring the integrity of the model so that they're not providing, imbalanced output or bias and other ways. Japan and India just at the threshold now of starting to do that. So a lot of it is sector driven. But when you think about the data, and to your point, you've now got models that are learning through the bringing in of data across multiple jurisdictions, across borders. And so CISOs are really struggling now to ensure that key point that Ben mentioned, which is the observability piece, being able to understand what can they see and what do they have access to so they can define what data is being used and how it's being used, while also respecting the regulatory requirements, things like rights to be forgotten or, right to have access to data by, citizens or customers, and ensuring that your backup platforms and your infrastructure is set up in a way that can provide that, meet the regulatory requirements, but also be cognizant of, those sovereignty and data transfer requirements. China and Indonesia, I mean, those are two countries that we always heavily watch in terms of providing guidance around just that, the ability to be able to transfer data in a way that complies with the local regulation. So it's a fast-moving space. And again, it's one of those situations where the regulators are trying to catch up and organizations are really jumping on top of this.
Makes sense, David. I think the whole lot about communication is, as Ben has mentioned, right? But training, educating, where can AI goes, where are the boundaries, how we can use them at the maturity of the different verticals, David has mentioned, or even across the countries they are trying to adopt, right? Of course, one clear direction is everyone are adopting AI and ML in multiple ways, right? That is the direction forward. On the appetite of using that is highly dependent, again, David, as you mentioned earlier on, which I like to stress upon over here, right? The governance and the regulation of how AI can be utilized in the most optimum and rightful way for the organization, right? So thanks for that. And that leads up to the last question, which is, I'll put it as a bit more generic and broad sense, whereby when it comes to a skill set, right? Ben, you spoke about this from a educating perspective, training perspective, right? In skill sets gap, if there's any, as well as managing a business outcome, right? And all that we are doing over here when it comes to data resilience, there's also a business outcome from the board or the executive in managing the rightful cost in the rightful investment, right? So Ben, I'll probably start off with you, right? What do you think is the growing skills gap that's kind of matching up both this or balancing both compliance and data resilience disciplines over here?
Yeah, I think broadly we're seeing, as these regulations change, as they evolve, as they get more complex, as we move data from traditional just on-premise infrastructure to SaaS platforms to clouds, all of a sudden our resilience and our data protection requirements change. And so there's a big gap now of understanding what products, could protect us in that case, or, do we have the right architects in our own company? Do we need to invest in those people to actually help us protect that? So I think what's driving, I think, a lot of the Veeam Data Cloud growth in region is a couple of things. One is our regional deployment model. So ticking a lot of compliance boxes from a regional standpoint, making sure that, if you have to have data in Singapore, you can have that there, or in Japan, or in Australia, wherever that might be. So that ticks a lot of the residency requirements. But then I think the reason we're seeing such success from a Veeam Data Cloud standpoint is because the backup as a service mentality, it takes away that specialist dependency of having to have architects to manage and run infrastructure, traditional backup infrastructure. With its, single management plane that can sit across multiple regions for those sort of multi-regional organizations that we have here, they can still see that single top level, their kind of, how their data protection, how the resiliency is looking, but still maintain those residency requirements. And I think lastly, I'll finish with this is the cost, the managing cost side of things. We've made Veeam Data Cloud very easy to consume. A lot of it's either fixed cost or at least has predictable costs known kind of bands that you'll move up through. So that can, that helps organizations out a lot when they're going into kind of, their yearly cost planning, making sure they're budgeting for this, and then getting rid of all of the kind of unknown costs of, traditional infrastructure or people, etc. that might be kind of in an organization, all now moves to kind of this Veeam Data Cloud world. So I think, a lot of it comes down to backup as a service, or investing in our people to make sure that they're aware of, how to protect these various different places that we now see our data moving to.
Makes sense, right? Either investment has to come from internally within the organization on subject matters expertise or specialists, right? If not, leverage on the vendor, Ben, as you mentioned, right? As a service, right? Whether it be backup as a service or SaaS offering, right? Whereby you do not need that much of a specialized skill set to kind of start your journey into this overall skills gap, right, in compliance and data resilience, right? David, probably wanted to hear from you, right? We spoke about technical specialists. Ben spoke about that, right? That often lack that compliance notion or expertise, right? That's kind of a drill down into this question, a balancing of we are investing in subject matters expertise, but they do not have the compliance expertise. Do we need to invest in another team of compliance? And then obviously the communication has to be there. And probably the last bit of sub-question to this will be, security has always been seen, I have no budget, I need to invest because of the resilience and everything, right? But does budget constrain limited kind of compliance headcount when it comes to that required skill sets when it comes to into the aspects of compliance and regulation, right? Yeah, David.
You've hit the point really well, Ray. I think, traditionally organizations have spent a lot from a security controls perspective on protection and detection. And they've been throwing, more money into the latest widget, the latest gadget that sort of fits into that space. And what we've seen is that there's been less investment around governance, which only just recently became a formulated part of the NIST framework, and also the recovery aspects. And so I think I mentioned earlier, Ben and I and the rest of our CTO team have been, and the SE teams, have been going out and running these workshops. Organizations are now much more prepared to attend, these roundtable simulation workshops that we've been running. And we encourage different individuals from within the organization to attend this, because it's not just about IT or security or the backup folks. Bringing everybody in and going through a simulated incident really does a couple of things. Number one, it brings everybody to the same table and starts unifying the cadence and the language that's used around an incident. That includes things like compliance requirements and regulatory requirements and, what does resilience mean? But it also ensures that we're sort of breaking down those silos and just recognizing that the accountability of being able to respond and the role that an individual within an organization plays in trying to work through an incident is really important. We know, I mentioned the data resilience and maturity model. We know in the best organizations that more than 70% of their support staff are response ready trained. So we know that the training and changing that culture really pays off and unlocks greater value when it comes to having to live through an incident. So I think, we'll still see a lot more organizations, attending these workshops that we're doing. We're doing them to sort of target the senior level decision holders, but we're also doing it at the operational level, just to give a sense of how you need to be sort of part of the solution and not sitting back and thinking, it really doesn't affect my role. I don't have a part in trying to restore business as usual if something happens to the organization. So I think that's what we're seeing, and that's how we're sort of trying to support this skills gap that we see.
Thanks, David. We are almost at the top of the hour. In closing, first of all, David and Ben, appreciate the insights. I think we have a lot of views from what we can do. I believe that helps our audience over here knowing what should be done in terms of the communication aspects, in terms of the training, the enablement, at the same time, right? The overall data resilience journey that Veeam is trying to march forward and build together with our customers, right? It's an ongoing journey. Sadly, it's never ending. There's always today has to be better than yesterday, right? It's always that chase to be highly resilient, right? And on that note itself, David and Ben, you have teed it up. What's the next course of action that we will recommend for our customers, right? I think, David, you brought that up just before our closing data resilience maturity model. DRMM, in short, we have invested a lot into the data resilience journey. And one of the start point, right, a very important start point is to start with assessing your own, what you call horizon in terms of maturity when it comes to security posture. And this DRMM is vendor neutral, is unbiased, is co-developed with McKinsey. So with that note, I would like to close the session on, please do visit our Veeam.com to start this data resilience journey together with Veeam on our DRMM approach. Thank you for your time in joining our session today. Have a great day forward. Thank you very much.